In complete silence, 200 Apache warriors gathered outside Fletcher Knox's barn. They stared at his front door while their battle paint was still fresh. But 12 hours, Fletcher didn't realize at the time how sharing his final piece of bread would transform the Arizona sun's life. As he emerged from his cabin, wiping perspiration from his brow at the age of 34, he looked down ruthlessly on Fletcher's worn ranch. Discovered how to read the desert like a book, yet today something sounded off. The typical sounds of the wind and animals seemed to muted and replaced by a spooky silence that made him shudder. He was looking at he noticed a tiny native boy, perhaps 8 years old, near the fence line by the creek. The child's ribs were visible through his ripped shirt as he huddled behind a boulder, and his dark eyes had the hollow expression of Fletcher's heart tightened as he saw the youngster frantically searching through the food after going days without eating, likely looking for roots or anything edible in the ground. Fletcher came slowly, his hands showing, and emptied the youngster stiffened like a trapped animal about to run, but he was too weak from hunger to do so silently. Fletcher took out the piece of bread he had packed for lunch and set it on a rock in the space between them. The child's eyes widened as they darted between the meal and Fletcher's face in an attempt to ascertain whether this was a trap of some sort. The youngster snatched up the bread and quickly ate it, tears flowing down his face. Fletcher's throat constricted as he saw this tiny human being reduced to such desperation, his cheeks soiled with filth, pointed to his mouth and stomach in an attempt to indicate that there was more food in his cabin. First, the boy resisted all of his instincts to run, but as they walked, hunger overcame his terror. Fletcher saw the child favoring his left leg and the irate welts on his back as he approached the cabin. The child's mouth constricted like whip marks, as if someone had injured them. Despite his wrath, Fletcher moved slowly and gently because he was determined to help this youngster no matter what had happened to him. As the youngster sat carefully, Fletcher made a simple lunch of beans and cornbread to help him recover inside the cabin. By the door, prepared to run at the first hint of danger, the child's hands trembled as Fletcher gave him the plate. He struggled to grasp it, and Fletcher, who was seated across the room, gave him area and observed the youngster eating as though it had been weeks since he had eaten. But as the sun started to set and Fletcher built up a makeshift bed for his surprise visitor, who he had no idea was 20 miles away, a war party had already begun following the boy's trail. He wasn't just any lost aborigine. He was the nephew of, while the entire Apache Nation and Chief Standing Bear were looking for him. Fletcher wrapped a blanket around the sleeping youngster, didn't realize that by doing what any decent person would do, he was actually Fletcher. His peaceful property would be the scene of the most perilous standoff the area had ever witnessed in the morning. Heard his horses snorting uneasily in the corral, and something had frightened them. In his years he had learned to trust his animals' instincts more than his own while living on the frontier. The first dim glimmer of dawn was the native youngster was still soundly asleep on his tiny chest as he crept through his window and lay on the floor next to him. To prevent waking the infant, moved quietly while rising and falling. Fletcher snatched up his rifle and slipped to the window, where he spotted hundreds of Apaches. Warriors formed a perfect semicircle around his body while sitting still on horseback. They were just waiting, as if death itself had seized possession of the property without attacking or yelling threats. Human shape, and chose to set up camp on his doorway. The Fletcher's thoughts were racing as he attempted to count 50, 70, or perhaps over 100 armed men, and their faces were icy masks of resolve, painted for battle, and these weren't raiders or a tiny hunting group, and the quiet was more scary than any war cry could have been. It was the whole Apache Nation, and they came to help the boy who was asleep in the back. When he opened his eyes and saw Fletcher's face, the child stirred, most likely sensing the tension in the air. Knowing right once that something was amiss, the child crawled over on his hands as Fletch pointed toward the window. He dropped to his knees to look outside, and as soon as he saw the warriors, his face turned white with fear, and he started to shake with an uncontrollable sense of dread. Fletcher recognized that he had stumbled into something much more significant than a lost child. The young Apache wasn't just any Apache. He was significant enough to call in the army as a whole, someone so precious that hundreds of the most ferocious fighters in the someone, whose safety seemed to worth everything to his people, was southwest to Fletcher's doorstep. The youngster clutched Fletcher's arm and started talking quickly in Apache. His voice was so panicked that the Fletcher was unable to hear a word the boy was saying. Whatever had brought this youngster to Fletcher's property and left those whip marks was a source of contagious horror. Fletcher examined his ammo 12 since it had put him in a position where everyone might die. With 200 Apache warriors and 6 shots in his gun, he might as well they had been hurling stones at a mountain, but they were unable to flee since the warriors had surrounded the whole estate, and Fletcher was aware that attempting to flee would be interpreted as an acknowledgement of responsibility for whatever they believed he had done to the youngster. But as the light rose higher, Fletcher saw movement among the warriors, with one person standing off. The older man, who was riding slowly toward the cabin with elaborate scars and feathers in his hair that revealed the details of innumerable conflicts. Even from Fletcher could sense the authority emanating from him from a distance. He was obviously a chief, and he was approaching converse, but when the Apache chief got closer, Fletcher noticed something that made him sick to his stomach. The coiled whip in the worn hand was darkly stained with what appeared to be dried blood. Whatever this agreement was about, it was the same kind of whip that had left those marks on the boy's back. Fletcher came to understand that he was defending more than just a missing child. Someone who had reportedly gotten out of this chief's control saw the whip as well, and the boy started crying and pressed himself up against Fletcher's leg as if he were a scared animal looking for cover, in that Fletcher realized that refusing to return the child could result in war, while handing him back could result in his death. The Apache chief halted his horse 20 feet from Fletcher's porch so that he could speak in front of the entire Apache nation. Although his English was significantly accented, every statement was clear enough to avoid coming across as menacing. "White guy, you have taken what belongs to the Apache people and weighted with power. Please restore the you will live to witness another sunset." Fletcher enter his porch, boy. The boy was still concealed within, but Fletcher could hear him wailing quietly as he kept his weapon lowered but ready. Every instinct begged Fletcher to turn the boy over and protect his own flesh through the small cabin wall, but those whip. The youngster came to me bruised and starved, with marks etched in his memory like a brand. Provided him with food and shelter, but the chief's expression stayed neutral. There was a glimmer of surprise, perhaps even reverence, in Fletcher's. "Dark Cowboy, you say the truth with your eyes. The youngster is my nephew, a small Wolf who fled from punishment for stealing our winter stockpile's precious maize 3 days ago?" The Fletcher felt his jaw tighten. Corn or not, no child should have to endure a brutal beating and be hungry, and when a hungry child is punished by a desert, it's not fair. It's around the semicircle of fighters. Fletcher could hear the words cruelty hanging in the air like smoke after a gunshot. See anxiously stepping horses and hands rushing to weapons. He had just accused and accusing the Apache war chief of brutality in front of his whole force could launch a conflict or take his life within the next 10 seconds. But rather than issuing an attack, the chief got off his horse and approached. When he was only a few feet away, his worn face bore deep lines of tiredness, and Fletcher could see that there was further suffering that went beyond physical scars. "You have no knowledge of Apache customs, white guy. Being the son of my deceased brother, Wolf is not your typical child, and the spirits have designated him as our next chief after he broke the law by stealing the sacred corn. The memories of this land, which is older than your people's, made the Fletcher's mind spin as the pieces came together. This wasn't merely concerning food theft. It concerned a future leader who violated the most revered rules of his tribe. Believed that whipping was a ritual punishment mandated by Apache custom, but Fletcher was still uneasy about sending a scared 8-year-old. Despite knowing this, return to endure more suffering. What would you do to honor Apache if you were Fletcher? Law and bring a future leader back to face the justice of his people, or shield a terrified if you're unable to understand? Child from punishment, please leave a remark so I know which side you would support. Whether Little Wolf survived to become the leader his tribe required or not would depend on what Fletcher decided next. Died as a young lad who was unaware of the gravity of the chief's hand holding him. 200 warriors waited for his signal Fletcher as he moved to his knife. Had only a few seconds to choose between being a fool who died defending someone or a coward who preserved his own life. Fletcher, another person's child, peered into the chief's eyes and decided to his own surprise he moved away or grabbed his gun, pressed his weapon to the porch railing, and raised both hands in a gesture of peace, Chief. I listened to your remarks regarding your customs and laws, but before you take the boy Manto guy, may I ask you a question? Do you recall being 8 years old? The chief's expression remained the same, but he was hungry and would risk anything for food. Refused to grab his knife, Fletcher continued, despite being aware that he was on the precipice of death. That guy in there is more terrified than any child should ever be. Death. I'm not challenging your authority or your laws. Perhaps there is another method to deal with it that doesn't shatter his spirit, regardless of the punishment your traditions dictate. Entirely, and for a considerable amount of time, the only sounds were the wind rustling across the desert scrub and the anxious snort of the chief looked at Fletcher's face as if he were reading a map, looking for signs of weakness or deceit, and then he spoke. You would negotiate for the life of an Apache youngster. What leadership skills do you possess, white man? Fletcher felt perspiration running down his spine from the strain of teaching a future chief that decisions have repercussions. Despite the early cold, I am aware that fearful kids don't become good leaders, and I know that a chief who is kind when the chief's eyes widened a little as it became evident that its earned is stronger than someone who simply knows how to punish. No white guy had ever addressed him in this manner, showing him respect but not submitting to his authority while in the semicircle. Fletcher could see soldiers shifting in their saddles, casting doubt on his judgment. You speak bravely for a man. If you respect the cowboy's bravery or are ready to exact revenge for the insult to their commander, what would you have me do? Surrounded by death, to disregard our rules and act as though stealing holy food is okay. I believe the boy should be punished because the thief is a young Fletcher who carefully considered his response before saying no. However, perhaps instead of teaching him fear, those consequences could teach him wisdom. Perhaps there is a method to assist him comprehend why. Rather than merely making him fearful of breaking them again, those laws exist. Little Wolf materialized in the doorway as Fletcher heard the cabin door open. The child shouted something. In a quick Apache voice, no longer hiding but standing upright in spite of his obvious fear. The chief's face was shaken but unclouded, displaying a range of emotions, including astonishment, rage, and lastly, what the chief interpreted for could have been pride. Fletcher says he is prepared to accept his penalty, but he expresses gratitude to the white man for being sympathetic to him while his own he explains. You have taught him that courage sometimes means accepting help from unexpected places. The youngster was offering to give his life to save Fletcher's and everyone else's lives, and Fletcher felt his throat tighten. Present was aware that the child was braver than the majority of adult men Fletcher had encountered, but he was still only afraid. Boy attempting to follow his moral convictions, but the chief wasn't done, so he turned to speak to his troops. In Apache, his voice reverberated like thunder across the desert, and whatever he said set off a chain of events that when he concluded, some members of the battle party nodded in agreement while others were obviously objecting. A few warriors separated from the others and rode in the direction of the cottage, and the Fletcher's hand moved automatically. They arrived not as enemy cowboys, but with supplies, so the chief stopped him before he could reach his rifle. Assist. You in taking care of the youngster Fletcher, who was staring at you bewildered. I assumed you were taking him back for punishment. The chief's whole face changed as he grinned for the first time since coming. Oh, the punishment will follow, but first the young Wolf needs to understand what you've been trying to teach him. About leadership. Recognizing the various forms of strength, he will spend a whole moon with you, studying the customs of the white man. He returns to face Apache justice after surviving and being nice, but as a young Fletcher felt a wave of relief wash over him, but the chief's next words caused his blood to ice. Again, however, be mindful of this cowboy. If he is harmed while in 200 warriors under your care will return, and we won't be stopping by to chat. This time because only dust clouds remained over the horizon as the Apache warriors rode off. Fletcher felt as though he had just escaped a cyclone as he stood on his doorstep, while young Volf stayed at the doorway, observing the child. Recognized his uncle's fleeing form with a mix of relief and fear. Knowing enough English to understand that he was free for a month, but that his fate would not alter, Fletch turned to confront his unexpected house guest and discover that he was completely unprepared to care for a youngster, much less one from the child, who was from a different culture and hardly spoke his language, was still wearing his ripped shirt and old moccasins. Before they grew infected, those whip marks required the right care. "Looks like you and I are going to be roommates for a while," Fletcher murmured quietly. "Volf." The boy's eyes glowed with tears, but Fletcher could see the effort it took for him to square his little shoulders and nod firmly. Seemed courageous, and it made him think of himself when he was younger and still a fearful child attempting to be a man. Fletcher used the leftover supplies from the Apache warriors to clean and bandage little Volf's wound in the morning. The boy silently went through the agonizing procedure behind him, but Fletcher could see him holding on to the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. After he was done, Fletcher handed one of his own shirts to little Volf. Over the following few days, it remained clean and intact even though it hung around the boy like a clothing. They established a schedule where the Fletcher would take care of his animals and work on the property. As little Volf observed and absorbed all that white men had to offer, the kid was extremely intelligent, demonstrating Fletcher Apache wildlife tracking methods and picking up English language with astonishing quickness. The cowboy had never seen weather patterns like this before, but Fletcher could see the weight of his little Volf. Fate is bearing down on the child like a tangible load. Would occasionally pause mid-conversation to gaze off into the mountains, where his folks resided. As they ate by the fire, a young face was etched with concern that no 8-year-old should have to bear one evening. After Fletcher tried making Apache-style cornbread, little Volf finally confided in his uncle about his problems. "Claims that because I violated the sacred law, elders will decide whether or not I live." Although his English was improving daily, his voice trembled in anxiety. "If they chose to death, my father's spirit will be embarrassed, and I will never be the chief." Felt his sorrow for this young child who was attempting to bear the burden of his people's future on his small shoulder. "Little Volf, you made a mistake, but it doesn't mean you're a bad person or a bad leader because you were terrified and hungry. According to Apache law, stealing sacred food entails deciding to personal want over the needs of the tribe, which is not the chief's style." Fletcher gazed into the fire, looking for phrases that could console a youngster who may be executed for the crime of hunger. However, horses were approaching in the dark before he could reply, and the sound caused both of their hearts to stop. Fletcher snatched up his rifle and went to the window outside, where he could see torches flickering through the night. But these were white men, possibly 20 of them, armed for conflict, not Apache riders. From the shadows, a voice yelled, "Knox, we know you got that Apache child in there. Send him out and nobody must be harmed," Fletcher said, his blood freezing when he recognized the voice of Jeremiah. After months of attempting to instigate conflict with the nearby tribes, Wade, the territorial marshal, had somehow discovered little Volf and intended to assault the Apache using the boy as a pretext. Little Volf pressed shivering against Fletcher's side, knowing that little Volf wouldn't simply die if Wade got his hands on the youngster. Hundreds of innocent people would perish in a conflict between the Apache and all of the white settlements in the area. Fletcher rechecked his ammunition because of one marshal's desire and discovered that there were 18 rounds in it this time. It wasn't only hopeless to face 20 armed guys. It was suicide, but as he gazed he knew he couldn't allow Wade to transform this courageous child into the flame that flared when he looked down at little Volf's frightened face. Taking down everything that Fletcher's neighbors had constructed, the question was, how can a child be protected when a whole army of SWDs mines raced Your own people wanted to use him as a weapon. He could hear men strewn around his property, their torches casting a ring of flickering light in the shadows. Speaking quietly as they prepared for what was obviously going to be an attack on his cabin, "These weren't knocks, you have 1 minute." The police were attempting to apprehend a vigilante who intended to kidnap little Wolf by force. Dud voice reached. Either send out that Apache brat or we're coming in after him. The power of someone who has persuaded himself that he was carrying out good deeds, whose followers have been robbing our supply lines for months in order to convey to them that Fletcher was aware that Wade was deceiving the Apache. Had not raided anyone in for than a year, not since the signing of the peace treaty, yet prejudice and fear managed to make, when it provided a justification for the violence they had been seeking. Males are more likely to believe what they want to believe. In an eager whisper, little Wolf pulled on Fletcher's sleeve and said, "I go to them." "Stop fighting because of me," Fletcher said, glancing down at the courageous and frightened youngster face, and had a wave of defensive rage that startled him with how strong it was. As he said, however, "No chance, kid, you're staying right here where you belong." Fletcher was aware that they were encircled and outnumbered by Wade's troops, and that battling them would only result in little even worse. If Fletcher shot any of Wade's posse, it would provide the marshal with the precise justification he needed to kill Wolf, declared war on the Apaches, saying that they had deceived a white man into attacking his own people. When Fletcher heard the sound of oncoming danger, it made his heart leap with both fear and hope. Horses traveling quickly through the night from the opposite way, either Chief Standing Bear had chosen not to wait a full month before checking, or the cavalry was arriving to restore order. Wade, his nephew, heard it as well, and his speech took on a concerned tone. "Damn it. Knox, you called in the Apache, didn't you? You are betraying your own people." The irony nearly made Fletch giggle. Wade believed that Fletcher had somehow called in Apache reinforcements, but the riders that were coming were if Standing Bear and his warriors discovered white men posing a threat. It was most likely the last thing Fletcher wanted to see at this time. The delicate truce that Fletcher had achieved that morning would break like glass. Little Wolf, at the sound of Fletcher, could see Wade's soldiers becoming agitated, their torches faltering as the sound of galloping horses increased. Attempted to look into the shadows beyond of their sphere of light. These were farmers and townspeople, not valiant troops, sufficient to frighten a lone cowboy, but unprepared to confront Apache soldiers in through the window. Fletcher saw individuals riding horses emerge from the shadows during a night combat, but Fletcher was shocked to see that these weren't Apache warriors at all in charge of the group as they rode into the torchlight. Was the closest town's Sheriff Tom Bradley, who was followed by a dozen deputized citizens' men that Fletcher identified as sheriff. Bradley's speech broke through the silence of the truthful settlers who refused to support WD's vigilante justice marshal. Wade whirled his horse around the night like a whip. "What right do you have to threaten people on their own land?" "Sheriff, this man is obviously taken by surprise when Bradley shows up. He is hiding an Apache fugitive, and he has violated territorial legislation and put any white family in the area in jeopardy." Bradley wrote, "I've had a telegram from the territorial governor himself stating that," closer, his hand resting lightly on his revolver, "while a peace deal is being negotiated, the boy is officially protected." Wade Fletcher, who was breaking the law here, experienced a brief moment of relief. Young Wolf Fletcher was tugging at his sleeve once more, pointing to the window while his wide, terrified eyes followed the boy's gaze. Noticed movement in the shadows behind the two groups of white men and Apache warriors, with scores of them coming out in silence from he had actually brought an army to check on his nephew, and the night had arrived like ghosts, leaving the body naked. Fletcher's property was now the scene of a three-way conflict involving territorial police officers, Apache warriors, and vigilante settlers. Anyone's mistake may transform the desert into a battleground that future generations would remember. But as Fletcher observed the leader riding slowly into the torchlight, when he saw the Apache leader's expression, he understood that Standing Bear wasn't there for battle. seemed composed, almost amused, as he looked about at the mayhem that had broken out around his when Standing Bear spoke. His words carried the silence of his nephew's temporary residence, authority of a person who understood and had all the cards. White guys appear to be incredibly agitated over a single young guy. Perhaps we ought to have a civil conversation about this. There was a lot of tension in the air before someone did something stupid that was irreparable. Fletcher could practically taste it. 3 armed gangs surrounded his house in a lethal triangle with WD's vigilantes facing each other. Sheriff Bradley's officers, with their responsibility and restraint, Standing Bear's Apache and their torches, and hatred warriors with one anxious trigger finger and hushed, deadly patience might escalate this conflict into a slaughter that would reverberate throughout the region for the bear, which had been standing for decades, slowly and painstakingly dismounted, his moves calculated to demonstrate that when he stated his mind, he was not scared of any of the white males in front of him. The authority of a voice that had commanded respect long before any of us could heard it carried across the desert night. I visited Arizona to observe how my nephew learns white, and these pioneers had even seen it. Instead, I encounter white guys who are unable to reach a consensus on whether to the chief's eyes passed over WD's position with apparent disdain, suggesting that Apache justice is dud face reddened in the torchlight, and his justice was less complicated than that of the white man. His hand went to his revolver. Stop lecturing us about justice. Marshal Wade's tirade was interrupted by Sheriff Bradley's voice. Like a sword, I'll have you jailed for inciting violence against treaty protections if you say anything else. Fletcher noticed Wade's soldiers appeared unsure, now torn between their marshal's commands and the actual, these weren't seasoned murderers. They were afraid of the prospect of being taken into custody by police authorities. Bear examined the scene of farmers and shopkeepers who had allowed fear and prejudice to trump their good judgment, with the composed demeanor of a man who has witnessed enough folly in his life to identify it when it seemed. Sheriff, you seem like a guy of integrity, Bradley. Maybe you could explain why some of your people want to take my nephew away when he is already getting the penalty that we decided upon. And Bradley politely took off his hat. Chief Standing Bear, the governor, acknowledged that Marshal Wade operated without territorial authority, that your contract with Mr. Knox is legally enforceable. These men are not entitled to. Fletcher felt Little Volf's tiny hand slide into his and squeeze to get in the way. The boy was trembling reassuringly, but he was no longer hiding, was observing. The 3 adult groups debate his destiny with the serious demeanor of a person considerably older than his 8-year-old. Wade wasn't prepared to give up, and his people have been robbing the supply wagon where he is most likely gathered. The look of the Standing Bear remained unchanged, but all of the Apache warriors behind him moved in anticipation of future attacks. Fletcher noticed a little movement in their saddle and identified it as the same subliminal preparation he had observed, and while before they were hit, Marshal Wade Standing Bear muttered softly, "My people haven't taken anything from you in more than a year, but if you want to accuse someone, maybe we should reach an agreement. In the conventional manner, just you and I, armed with any weapons you choose." Everyone in the room knew that Standing Bear was giving Wade an opportunity to back up his offer, which hung in the air like smoke. His life for his charges, and everyone knew that Wade would never, despite his bravado and bigotry. Marshall wasn't entirely foolish before accepting such a challenge. Wade was able to reply, but Little Volf startled everyone by coming out onto the porch and speaking loudly enough in English. I'll speak for myself now that I'm little, because the boy made an announcement that altered everything, and 3 groups heard it. Chief Standing Bear's nephew, Volf, was the future Apache leader, violated the law and was punished, but I also discovered that several white guys offer compassion to adversaries, and some Apache warriors provide forgiveness to those who violate tradition. Perhaps this is something we can all benefit from. The 8-year-old boy stood on,